But I do think a lot of the reality of also how social media screening happens is it's a hiring manager, a manager Googles somebody for 10 minutes and sees what are the red flags I can find. And so it's often a very unsystematic process. It's often something that's not very well comparison based. It's something where a lot of bias can come into what's going on, right? And that's something where our own experience and our own background can have impact.
For my generation, Facebook is still, we think of it as a new thing. We view it with a slight amount of cynicism, maybe suspicion, I mean, in social media generally as well. And I think most of us recognize the fact that it's a public forum unless you're very careful with your privacy settings.
Yeah.
And you have to work on the assumption that anything you put there will be in public. And so a potential employer might be able to see it and it might come back on you. So, think accordingly before you post things. But I wonder whether generations who have been born after the invention of social media have a different relationship with it maybe, and how almost everything in their whole lives goes on there. I shudder to think how many times I might have been fired if everything I thought or said as a teenager was in the public domain.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And that's one of the things I do think is pretty interesting, because Facebook privacy settings, which I will say that there's been a number of times that someone had privacy settings set, but one of their connections wasn't quite as good a friend as they thought, and so they screenshotted it.
Yeah, exactly.
You just need one person who's not really your friend.
Welcome back to this week's episode of Leading with Integrity. Now, 2 questions, topics, issues, things that I'm thinking about all the time, they come up in nearly every conversation, are the future of work, what it's going to look like in 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 years time from now, and the role of social media in our work lives. What is it in reality? What should it be? What is problematic about it? What works quite well? What's good and bad? And if you've listened to any previous episodes, you'll know these 2 things come up quite frequently. So today I thought it would be really interesting to get an academic involved in this conversation, someone who has studied both of these things at various points of his career. And so today's guest is Gordon Schmidt. He's a professor of management. He's the director of the Turrentine School of Management at the University of Louisiana Monroe in the US. He researches leadership. He's worked on the future of work, management science. He's done a bit on the role or the implications, if you like, of social media and things like hiring and firing. And he's also written a few books on leadership and making it more accessible via popular culture. So, in fact, his co-author, Sai Islam, was on the podcast last month. I've lost track of days. I think it was last month. Anyway, if you've heard previous episodes, if you're a long-time listener, you'll recognize the name, hopefully. We talked a lot about Marvel characters and the leadership in the Marvel universe on that episode, and it's going to come up again today. So it's great to have Gordon with us. Really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm sure it's going to touch on some really useful and practical tips for both of these issues and for leadership more generally as well. So stick around.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Gordon, welcome to Leading with Integrity. It's lovely to have you on the show. Really looking forward to our conversation today. I know it's going to be a great one because you've got so many different areas of expertise and they're all very relevant and very interesting.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun.
Great. Well, so best place to start. Over to you, really. Tell the listeners a bit about yourself, your career so far, your background, what you do today, and why you do it.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Gordon Schmidt. I've got a doctorate in industrial organizational psychology from Michigan State University. I'm a professor of management at the University of Louisiana Monroe. I also am the director of the Turrentine School of Management here. So I oversee 6 different academic programs here as well. Let's see. I also, I do research and teach. I teach related to leadership, human resources, and management topics. And then I do research on a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm sure we'll get to a lot of it, but looking at stuff like the future of work. I do stuff on using popular culture to teach management and leadership ideas. We got a book or two on that, a book on Leaders Assemble Leadership in the MCU that's about teaching through Marvel movies. And we have a book on Avatar: The Last Airbender and leadership, elements of leadership, that's coming out in November of this year. So, and why am I interested in this?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, basically sort of in high school, I got kind of really interested in psychology and sort of understanding why people do what they do and think how they think. And that kind of led me into, that kind of path of thinking about psychology of the workplace in a lot of ways. And so, I kind of think it's really important. We spend a lot of time in work. We spend a lot of time interacting with others. And so to do that effectively and try to understand what's going on, I think is kind of important. And after kind of getting into academics, I found that a lot of academic stuff is very esoteric, hard to understand, even if you're an expert, confusing, contradictory. And so that's led us to try to do a decent amount of kind of research and outreach to try to make these ideas understandable. Because there's a lot of stuff that, is very confusing and not really pushed out into society where it could really help. And so that's kind of what I try to focus on a little bit more, is that clarity and understanding with a lot of my work, because I think it's important. So that's probably the big answers, I think, to the questions.
yeah, definitely. No, I certainly agree with that last point in particular. I don't think that's unique to leadership and management study, though. I think,
Oh, it's not.
Any area of academia, in my experience.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So loads of stuff that you've mentioned in there. I think what I find particularly interesting about what you do is you're doing the academic, you're doing the theory of leadership and management, you're teaching it, but you're also doing it in practice because of one of the roles or a couple of the roles that you hold there as well. So
Sure.
That has to be quite exciting a lot of the time, because you can get like the cutting edge of the theory, and then do you test it on your people? Is that the right way of saying it? I don't know.
I wouldn't say to them I'm testing it on you, but
no, of course not. No.
Applying it. I do think it is. I try to think of the, okay, what does the research suggest? How should I consider this stuff? Because I do think one of the big things really too is like that self-awareness. Is there's just a lot of, it's very easy to just kind of move forward and assume other people agree. If you're in charge, it's very easy to think that you understand all the angles. And that's not necessarily the case. And so I definitely do try to apply some of that leadership into what I do, and things like shared leadership where, somebody who works for me is probably a better expert at a topic, especially, as I said, I'm over 6 programs, management I know pretty well, but marketing or risk management, insurance, or agribusiness, or drones, which is under me as well. Like, I don't know as much in those areas, and those people know more. They know more about the field. They know more about the student base. And so I do think there's a lot of times when, as a leader, and the research supports it, that you've got to let others lead, and you've really got to take their input into account. And so, yes, I really try to do that. From a psychology background, it's all the, psychological biases we have in that. So I'm always kind of like, okay, well, this seems like a good idea, but is this really a good idea, or does it just fit with my preconceived notions? Does it fit with, escalation of commitment and sunk costs and all that stuff, or is it really the right thing to do? So I don't know. It's an interesting way to do it. It is. You can't. Some of those leaders seem so confident they've got the perfect answer, but they don't. and I don't either. And so it's I've got to go at it a little bit of trying to make sure, okay, let me double check, let me get info, versus just always charging ahead based on a hunch. So
yeah, and I think that's the better way to do it. I don't know. Personally, I'm always slightly suspicious of the leader who's that like supremely confident that their answer is the perfect one and no others will be any good.
Oh yeah.
I've seen that go horribly wrong. that leads me into another question, actually, as you were talking there. So obviously I'm asking about whether you're applying the theory that you're learning, that you're developing, that you're teaching to the people you're leading. But actually, the equally interesting question is, how often does it happen the other way around? How often does something you experience as a leader working with the people that you work with impact what you're doing on the theoretical side?
Yeah, well, and I do think that, it's a lot of my life ends up being something happened in real life, and then it makes me think about research and what we should do. So one of the things that really started me looking at kind of like social media and the future of work and technology on the workplace was me in grad school trying to get a job. So I actually joined Twitter and LinkedIn in part to try to network some to hopefully, get a faculty position. And so it's a very practical use. It was, as atheoretical as you can get as a graduate student. Your life kind of is theory almost as a graduate student to some degree, because you're so immersed in all that stuff. But it was doing that made me start to think about, okay, how does this stuff really affect the workplace? What is it about? And so we ended up doing, some panels at some major conferences that came through just connections on LinkedIn and stuff like that. And so I would say a lot of that started pretty atheoretical. It was a practical goal of mine to get a job, and people say social media could help. And that did kind of lead to a lot of the technology research, that I ended up doing. And I think with some of the stuff that we've done related to pop culture for outreach and all that, stuff like the Marvel book, a lot of that did come out of just like, this is something I like, and talking to, my buddy Cy Islam about, leadership in one of the Marvel movies and stuff kind of helped to spark the idea of doing a book on it. There's a call for books related to using pop culture to teach leadership. And it's like, Marvel would be good for that. Cy and I are talking about Marvel all the time anyways. This would be a great idea. This would fit actually the book pretty well. It'd kind of marry interests together. So yeah, I don't know, kind of being curious, just keeping out there. Like almost everything kind of makes me think, oh, it'd be cool to study, or anything that's vaguely confusing to me. I'm like, that would be good to study, or like, why did that happen? You're like, well, maybe we should look into it. So absolutely. Yeah, I would say there's a lot of that back and forth. And, I think that's one of the things with stuff like virtual leadership and virtual work. Like I've done a lot of working with people all over the globe on projects. My first book that looked at social media and selection, my co-author and I didn't meet in person ever during the course of writing the book. We had met previously, and we've, met since, but not during the book. And we had, 15 chapters of various writers across the world, that I'd met some of them here and there, but most of them, I still haven't met some of them in person, almost 10 years later. And so the idea of virtual work being something that is useful or could be useful, like it's right there in my life. It's a very practical thing that it can be done, and it can be done effectively. And so, yeah, so absolutely, like real life is one of the big things that inspires me all the time in the research.
No, I think that's the right way to think about it, the right way to have your research be led, actually, because it's like that inquisitiveness, isn't it, and the scientific method and that whole approach, which I really love and applaud.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, the long-time listeners will have recognised Cy's name because he'd been on the show before. I say I have to think about the timing of it because I have a backlog at the moment. So this is going to be released probably early December, and Cy's episode will have been last month by the time this is out. I get myself tied up in circles.
Yeah. I'm traveling, basically.
Yeah. The listeners will recognise his name anyway, hopefully. So there we go.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. So yeah, I mean, there's quite a few threads there that I'd love to pull on. So let's start with the future work, because it's one of the big buzz phrases these days, isn't it, in leadership and in management? And we've got more buzzwords. Buzzword bingo. Here we go. So we've got gig economy, hybrid working, remote work, and then we've got great resignation, quiet quitting. What is it? Bare minimum Mondays or something is another one that I've been hearing lately.
I don't know if I heard that one, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, where is the future work going, do you think? Are these things going to become normal to the point that they won't even be buzz phrases anymore, or are they going to disappear? And where do you see it going?
Well, I do think it depends on what kind of the average work unit is and what do people do. So there's a lot of stuff, if you look historically, phrases are used in particular ways, but then when it becomes a normal, it doesn't. So I just think of like, a pen, like the pen that you write with. Like you can also call it an ink pen, right? But if you want to clarify, it's a pen with ink that you write with, but we generally don't, because you assume when we say pen, we don't mean pen is like a pen that you're putting animals in. We assume it's not something else. We assume, oh, it's that thing. Of course, now that we're using less physical stuff, we might need to call it an ink pen again, because maybe it won't. Maybe you think of a stylus pen as the default pen. But that's kind of how our language works. So I think some of that stuff, some of that stuff might become just the normal, the normal type. It's not e-work, and we've seen that various ways to call stuff, putting e's in front of stuff, email being, one of those, e-work, which we're not saying nearly as much. So I think some of the terminology might change, as well as some of it might just not be as useful anymore. I even think stuff like remote work, if we think of remote work as working when you're not in a physical workplace, there's a lot of that goes on now. And even stuff like checking your work email outside of work, no one's really saying, oh, I'm a remote worker because I checked my email at 7 p.m. But it basically is remote work. So some of those tasks end up becoming just normal tasks, not special types in that particular way. So the terms is, to me, terms are mostly about how do we organize stuff, or how do we distinguish it from something else. And I think that we'll see some of those terms kind of go away. I do think something like future of work, I like the phrase because it's pretty broad and it can fit a lot of stuff. So when I started doing work in this area, it was social media in the workplace was kind of the idea. It was all about Facebook and LinkedIn, all these things. But now that's not as central to what the technology in the workplace is. And so the future of work can kind of take all those different areas a lot easier. Maybe we'll come up with a new way for it. And we do have the issue that a lot of our phrasing is like, this is the modern era of art. Well, the modernity of art is like 100 years old now, if I remember correctly. And so, if we've got the new era, or, the postmodern, postmodern is 100 years old now too. And so whenever we're talking about the future or the newest thing, at some point it's going to be just the thing, or it's going to be old. So I'm sure what's future now is not going to be future in even 10 to 20 years. So it's going to continue to be a moving target. We've seen some of that with Web 2.0, Web 3.0, Industry 4.0. And some of those have had moving targets of what they are as well, with what that technology is. They're a nice way to organize things in a moment, but in 10 to 15 years, those organizations might not really make much sense. And I've seen some people go back and revise Industry 2.0 and Industry 3.0 into different definitions now that we're at a new version anyways. So buzzwords ultimately, but some are useful.
Yeah, I mean, the same is kind of true of leadership theory, isn't it, I guess? 'Cause, I mean, a lot of the ideas that we might consider to be modern leadership approaches have been around since the 70s in some cases, and I wouldn't call that particularly modern now. So,
oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that gets relabeled, or there's overlap. So stuff like transformational leadership and authentic leadership and servant leadership, they can be different, but how you apply them sometimes is not really that different. And so there's this sort of massive overlap of what we might either is good leadership or we think might be good leadership that kind of is in a few different theories at once.
Yeah, absolutely. And so setting aside the buzz phrase side of it and what we might decide to call it, there's probably a lesson in there, isn't there, for the people who come up with these names? Maybe don't use words like modern or new because they're going to run out pretty soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, so yeah, that's one issue. And then in terms of like the actual practice of work, I mean, there's a big movement, or there has been, and it's made the headlines a lot, the quite often perhaps unfairly painted as the sort of the predatory bosses forcing everyone back to the office to justify real estate prices and all these other kinds of conspiracy theories. But do you think it's going to be, do you think hybrid is the future? Do you think we'll eventually end up everyone will be remote unless they, I don't know, work in the service industry or something, for example? Or do you think we're going to end up back in the office all the time? Where do you see it going?
So one of the biggest issues I actually think, and this is a tangent from what you said, but I think is important, is what is the unit of work we're hiring a person to do? Mm-hmm. And I think that's often one of the hardest things is we kind of think like, oh, if you spend 8 hours in an office, you're going to be productive. You're going to do what you're supposed to do. But people, they're on their phone at work, or they're reading a book, or they're doing a million, or even the water cooler. They're talking to other people for hours on end and not actually working. But if I think they're physically there, I think they must be working. And so I do think it is part of a unit of work issue. Is like if you were supposed to work for 8 hours and you get your job done in an hour at home, are you stealing 7 hours of time from me, or is your job not correctly modulated, or are you just that dang good and so that should be fine? And that's where I think, stuff like piecework of, oh, you got to make 100 of something or 100 sales is a lot easier in theory to look at than, oh, you're a knowledge worker and we need you to do some unknown amount of work during a daytime. And so I do think that's part of the move to bring people back, is the idea of people are, I've heard, some people are doing 2 jobs at home, or, they're not working many hours, that type of thing. But it's partly comes down to this issue of we don't have a good assessment of work beyond the hours you put in. And you see that in some organizations. You see that actually in graduate school as well. There'll be people that like sleep in the office and spend every moment there. And so it makes it look like to some people, to some bosses, that they're must be productive or really dedicated. When, if you can get all your work done 2 hours at home on a Monday and be done, you're as productive as the person that takes 20 hours and produces the same amount of work, right? So my personal feeling on it is we're going to be seeing more remote work, especially as we kind of understand what we want people to produce. Because I think, of course, part of the weird thing of how, kind of time and society works is, generally the oldest workers are the ones who are in the highest positions, and they're the ones most detached from the new technology and methods. And so the fact they think you have to be physically in the office is very reasonable based on their experience, but may not be reasonable for younger workers with more technological savvy, that type of thing as well. And so I will be curious in 20 years if there's not a debate. It's that the people that are moving into those bigger roles, of course, they know remote work works, so therefore that's what we're doing. Perhaps overdoing it is a possibility, but I do think remote work can be done more. I do think we need to figure out better what is virtual leadership. How do we get people to feel connected to their organization when they're not physically there with other people? Because kind of it's assumed kind of magically we care about our coworkers and our company if we're there sitting in office together sharing space. We don't have to. We all know people that we've worked with or work with that, hate everyone else with a passion and, would burn the building down in a moment if they could get away with it, right? But so they're not magically transformed by being physically there. Some of them probably would love remote work and be a lot better for them. And so I do think we do have to think more about how do we really build human connection between people besides it magically happens when we're physically co-located. And I think companies that do a better job of that are going to, that's going to help them to be able to have remote workers that provide, the right amount of work that fit that type of area. But most of the research that has been able to be done on remote work is it's as effective as face-to-face. For some people, it's more useful. It saves things like commute time and all of that jazz. And so I do think organizations that are trying to keep good workers should be trying to allow remote work and those things, because it's not that all your bad workers are the ones who want to work from home and slack off. There's a lot of good workers, especially younger workers, that want or need that type of thing. And so you're not necessarily doing a great job of selecting people by just losing all those people that want to remote work. So I think we'll see more, especially for a lot of things, and a lot of face-to-face stuff can be provided by, robots and technology as well. So some of the jobs that definitely have to be face-to-face now, some of that will probably be reduced. Depends on the cost, depends on what things like consumers want. So do consumers want a robot serving them food in a restaurant? I don't know. I'm sure some people think it's cool. Some people might be against it, and some don't have a big opinion. If the robots are good enough at it, people will probably get used to some of those elements. And so I think that's some of the stuff we'll have to see. Of course, with generative AI and AI in general, there's a number of things that might be able to be automated well or put together in ways where we can deploy workers differently in that type of situation. So, so I'd expect to see more over time. And it does help. We can hire somebody all over the world to do something versus they have to be in our local area. And we've got a lot of places suffering of not enough local workers and all kinds of types of jobs that would be helped if we could hire somebody from a different state or a different area.
Yeah, you make some excellent points there. I think back to some of the bosses and some of the things they say over the years, and like the whole thing around, if you're not there 9 to 5, if I can't see you working, then you're not working. That whole mentality, and that was problematic anyway. Yeah. Even without remote work.
Yeah.
And then again, let's say the point you made just then about it's not just like the lazy workers, let's call them unfairly, the bad workers who are pushing to work from home. Actually, those workers are going to be doing less output anyway, wherever they are. It doesn't matter. So it feels like it's joining the dots between two very unrelated issues in order to push a position or a decision that's already been made, if that makes sense. And then, anyone who's ever spent any time in an office knows straight away it's nowhere near as productive as if you can work in your own space by yourself without distractions.
Yeah, well, that's the thing with COVID-19 is you had a lot of people push to work at home that did not have necessarily the best dedicated spaces. So if you're actually providing things well, and, there's been some discussion of, setting people up remotely, but providing them with, computers or providing them with various technology that allows them to do their work well. During COVID, it was a lot of like, good luck with what you have. Mm-hmm. But I think organizations really being intentional on remote work could probably get better productivity out of it with that, and people with, planning for, I need a dedicated space or I need that. If you can plan for that, I think you could be in a lot better shape. And less distractions, more productivity, that type of thing. Anyways, so I'd be curious for seeing organizations really leaning into remote work and supporting it versus it's like, well, you can work from home, but you better be able to do all the stuff you could do in the office with the technology we have here. That leads to some issues potentially too.
Yeah, it does. I think there's almost like it's almost like a question of privilege there as well, because the assumption on the part of the employer that people have personal computers or a laptop that's up to the standard to do the work that needs to be done, that may not be the case. And so if you're going to, COVID was a separate thing, but even then I would have said, if you're not giving them a choice because you can't, it's not your fault, but it's not the employee's fault either. You need them to do the work. You should provide the infrastructure that enables them to do so.
Absolutely.
If they were in the office, you wouldn't expect them to bring in their own computer to the office, would you? So why is it any different? Anyway, that's another very interesting tangent. And then there's the whole question of productivity as well, and what are we actually paying for? And I really like the way you describe it as units of work and what those might be. I think that's a great way of describing it and thinking about it. Because to me, like, productivity is output over time, isn't it? So if the time is shorter and the output's the same, you're more productive, and that should be a good thing. But the way salaries and compensation work is you're paid for a fixed period of time. So if you do the same work in 2 hours, most employers' response to that would be, great, do that again until the end of your shift. So they've got way more work out of you and paid you the same. And that, to me, is another area where there's that question over value versus time. And I think that's quite problematic as well, potentially, even in, say, a factory setting. Like if you've got an amazing factory operator who's producing 10 times as many widgets as anyone else on the line, and you're paying them the exact same, where's their motivation to keep doing that? Why should they keep innovating? Why should they be more productive if you don't reward it? And yeah, there's loads of issues around here, and I find them really interesting, and I don't know what the answers are.
Yeah, well, no, that's one of the big issues too, is what is useful in people's time and what they need to do. So even Taylorism scientific method that was kind of looking for the best way for people to work to get the most productivity out of them. Part of that was building in break periods. So you might have a really intensive 30 minutes, but then 15 minutes of break. It wasn't just, it's your lazy time. It was like, this is your recovery time, so you can then do the next thing. And I do think a lot of jobs, especially with the ones, as we're talking about, a boss needs to watch you to make sure you're effective every minute of the time. A lot of times for us to be creative or to be innovative or even to sometimes even be competent, we need, whether it's rest time or time to think. Being academics, I do think that's an issue we can have, that we can spend a lot of time on paperwork or other stuff when really probably almost everybody in any area that has creativity in it could use an hour a day to think, about new ideas, or just to kind of take a minute in that way would probably be very beneficial. Because we just, especially if you got a problem you're working on, a lot of times we just have to keep grinding on it versus, okay, let's take a breath. Let me, drink some coffee, let my mind wander a little bit. And then I might think of either a great solution to my problem or a great idea to work on. But a lot of that time to sort of think and reflect and, even learn, we don't have in workplaces in the same way. So yeah, if you for 2 hours of your 8 hours at home, get all your stuff done remote working, and then you think of creative ideas for even 3 hours of the rest, that's probably dang worth it to your organization, is what I would say. But we don't think of it that way.
Definitely. I don't know why, but the analogy that popped into my head there is like when you lose something in the house, like the car keys or something, and you spend like an hour looking, and you're convinced that you've looked everywhere, but you start looking in all the same places again. You just keep doing that, and you got stuck in your head. And you're not going to find that unless you stop and do something else, think about something else for a bit, and then come back and try again. And usually when you do that, first place you look, that's where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing. They do that actually in theory with learning with kids too. It's like, if you can't get the math problem, you should do something else and then come back to it. Just kind of trying to grind it for hours at a time. You're not going to be able to make that step forward. It's true for learning in general. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's true for any thought-intensive work. Not even thought-intensive necessarily, but yeah, there's that cliche, isn't there? A change being as good as a rest. I think that's what it's about.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so virtual leadership then. Can you tell us a bit more about the work you've done on that? And then perhaps what would be your best piece of advice for a leader who's struggling with that?
Sure. Yeah. So we've done a few different things on virtual leadership. Virtual leadership, this idea of being able to interact with people that are not physically co-located, being able to do that leadership process, influencing people's behaviors, their thoughts, their actions in that virtual environment. And so one of the things I think we talk about a lot is you need to think about virtual leadership as leadership, right? Is that it is this, you've got a lot of the same similar goals. It's that technology is part of that process to make those goals happen. And yeah, so we've got a paper on this that we talk about is when we think about technology usage and working with people remotely, we need to really think about, okay, what are my goals as a leader? What am I looking for? What's the influence? And then what are tools that can help me to do that? So I think a lot of times with stuff like technology, it just ends up being like we want to get what the new and hot thing is, even if it may not really fit our needs or it may not work with our feasibility. And so we even something like, how do we communicate with a remote worker? Should it be Zoom? Well, Zoom could be okay, or Teams could be okay, but what do they have for bandwidth? What do they have? Do they have a computer in their house, right? For some people, the best remote work communication means is like text messages, right? Or it could be phone calls. It depends on what we're doing, what our workforce is, what's the infrastructure in place. And so that's one of the things I think, we really need to be cautious about is there's a whole bunch of different ways we can get something done virtually. It's what's going to work for our particular context or area, and not just make it be like, oh, we're going to have, a virtual avatar for our leader, and that's going to make people motivated. If we got virtual Tupac, people will be creative. No, probably not. It's what are the bread and butter things that really help with that. And so that's what a lot of our work looks at. I think the other thing that we talk about related to things like the gig economy and leadership is that a lot of times there isn't designated leaders. We often think about leaders as there's somebody who tells everyone what to do. We all recognize that at the end. But with things like virtual online communities, things like gig work, is Uber drivers in theory aren't supposed to be talking to each other. They only need the app. Well, what we find is if you just use the app, you're more likely to go broke. You're more likely to not be able to make money. Joining online communities on places like Reddit allows you to kind of get trained a little bit on what other drivers are doing. It allows other people to basically act almost as leaders or trainers or mentors to you so that you can succeed. And so some of our papers on the gig economy talk about that, the importance of these bonds with other people, influencing other people, having mentors from these communities. And so I think it's, the online environment and virtual leadership is something where, you're a physical boss might not be that main thing. It can be virtual people online. It can be the AI. So Uber basically acts as your boss. It tries to motivate you in a lot of ways. It gives you feedback on how you're doing. It gives you work assignments. But what we tend to find as well is the relational aspects often are going to come from other people online. And so getting connected to communities of Uber drivers or other people doing Amazon Mechanical Turk can really help you to be successful and know what to do because the apps lack in that type of way. And so those are some of the areas I do think with virtual leadership that are different, but the goal ultimately is kind of the same. How do we help workers or motivate workers or to be able to do the correct work? How do we help them to stay motivated? Those are things that a leader wants to happen either way, whatever the environment is. It's just the tech tools play a role in what's going on. And often, to some degree, democratization of the leadership process, because any user on the subreddit for Uber can have an impact on other people. And if if it seems like they help, they'll have more influence on people over time as well. And so that unofficial leaders, those shared leadership is a very interesting area that is a lot easier to happen when you don't have that boss standing over your shoulder watching you every minute. The other Reddit user isn't watching every minute, but they might be able to help you. They might be able to influence how you do your job. And it's more of your choice versus, I got to listen to this dude because they're my boss standing there.
Yes, definitely. That's a side of it I hadn't considered. But I think, there's some cool questions there on there, like about how we actually define leadership and who does it. And again, there's that traditional aspect, as you were saying, where it's the boss, in inverted commas. And it's associated with a job title or the fact they own the company or whatever it might be. But actually, leadership is more than that, isn't it? Like anyone can do it. You can lead someone who's supposedly in a management position over you. It's a skill set. It's an activity. It's not a role. It's not a title. And I think that Uber example is a great way of illustrating that. And then the other thing with the virtual side of it, I guess it comes down to trust, in my opinion. Like if you're the sort of leader, manager founder, CEO, whichever, all of the above maybe,
Yeah.
who doesn't trust people to work when you can't see them, then actually you just don't trust people. It doesn't really matter whether you can see them or not. That's your issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that you're right, and we're going to see all of these issues just resolve themselves, and the future will be remote or hybrid at best. One thing we've not dug into yet is the social media angle. So I know one of the things that you got into was about people getting fired because of social media posts.
Oh, sure.
And so, I mean, that leads into a big question about what role, if any, does social media play in things like employee relations, in like your hiring decisions, your firing decisions, even the day-to-day workplace, and what role should it be playing? So, like, what's the reality, and then what should it be?
Yeah, well, I would say one of the things for me is that social media is used a lot more as a screening out of people. So people have posted something bad or something. I'll put controversial in quotes just because it may not be, it could be something that is very legal to say. It's it's an opinion that's very legal to have, but it may, your employer or a boss or somebody might think, oh, we don't want to get involved in that topic, right? Or whatever it is. And so I think there's a lot of what we do is looking at people's social media, say, oh, this person, they've got opinions, or they've got, maybe they're a slacker, maybe they're complaining about a previous employer. We should hire somebody else. And I think, there's certainly some things where you may want to use data in that type of way. There might be appropriate aspects. So people doing illegal behaviors, it's hard to justify, oh, we should hire somebody who's already doing illegal things. There's legal culpability sometimes with that, especially the types of jobs we're hiring people for too. But I do think a lot of the reality of also how social media screening happens is, so a hiring manager, a manager Googles somebody for 10 minutes and sees what are the red flags I can find. And so it's often a very unsystematic process. It's often something that's not very well comparison based. It's something where a lot of bias can come into what's going on, right? And that's something where our own experience and our own background can have impact quite a bit. So if I'm familiar with particular groups and I see, oh, you're in, you remember the Glee Club, you're like, oh, I was there too. And you may not say like that should get you hired, but it can unconsciously have that type of impact. There are some applications that have been done as well for computers to look at some of those aspects too. But a lot of times that functionally still an organization, it's a very informal, hey, we'll Google and see what we find, which I think is an unfortunate way to kind of do that. I do think social media connections between people can be useful for organizations. So we can get to know each other, a little bit more personally. We can kind of understand other people's context more, because I do think it's a lot easier to, be rude to somebody or fire somebody when we just think of them as, well, and that's a virtual too, is they're just some anonymous name versus they're someone with a family, they're someone, with their pros and cons, like everybody. And so I do think there's that potential for connections to help. There's a lot of informal information. So the stuff we talked about with gig workers being connected through social media can help with that information being passed. Some of that is stuff like gossip, but there is positive information that can come out of stuff like that too. And so we've seen some of those things happen. I've seen social media where people like share work shifts through Facebook groups or, send information that way. I don't know if that's the best way to do things necessarily, but we've seen different kind of interesting ways of kind of using that type of sites to kind of be part of the work process. We've seen secret groups on Facebook for unionization efforts by workers and secret groups for union busting by employers as well. And so we've seen both sides of that as kind of using social media as an organizing scheme where people are on. And so I think we've seen a lot of that. We've also seen some organizations really want their workers to, hype the organization through social media or share their content. I know I had several students who, worked at like clothing stores where the store would really want you to share their sales through your Instagram or that type of thing. And so part of your job becomes using your personal social media to hype the company, which feels a little scummy, but I can understand that a little bit. It's almost you become like an influencer representing your company on there. And influencers themselves, that's what they do. They get a product, they get paid for it, and that's part of their lifestyle brand or part of whatever their podcast is, hyping that company or their sponsor, that type of thing. And so I think that's something happening. What would I like to see more a little bit? Well, I do think looking at social media related to the positive side of what it provides. So people with a robust LinkedIn profile, people that interact with the community through it, those are people you may really want to hire for your organization because they really are well connected with others. They really do have a network you can see of people. Because obviously there's a whole collection of people that, make great claims about what they can do or their network. Most spam on LinkedIn does this, right? They're like, oh, we'll get you 10,000 followers for $50 and they'll be real or whatever it is. That's just a scam. But being able to look at indicators to see, hey, this person really is well known in their field. This person really is connected to their industry. That stuff's really useful. And I've seen that. I was at a meeting somewhere where somebody had said they got fired from their job, and someone was else like, "Are you on LinkedIn? I can connect you with these 8 people in HR that could help you, get that next position." And so I think there's a lot of potential energy. There's a lot going on that doesn't get reported as much, but I do think the positive side could be done more versus the fired side, which we've done research on that. And people have been fired for appropriate things and, things that really they shouldn't have been fired for as well. But yeah, as well as trying to make that systematic. How do we use that? Who gets fired and why is something we should be creating policies on for usage.
One of the things that I struggle with in recent years is this, especially when it comes to social media. I think COVID played a part in this as well, but it's kind of that blurring of the line between work and the rest of your life.
Oh, yeah.
So for me, with the exception of LinkedIn, which I see as a professional inverted commas network, so that is for work purpose, that's what it's there for. But things like Facebook and Instagram, those are personal accounts. So if I'm working for an employer who wants me to do something for the business on my personal Facebook page, the answer is no.
Yeah.
Right? So, but then the other side of that, and I wonder as well if there's a generational aspect to this as well, because for my generation, Facebook is still, we think of it as a new thing. We view it with a slight amount of cynicism, maybe suspicion, in social media generally as well. And I think most of us recognize the fact that it's a public forum unless you're very careful with your privacy settings.
Yeah.
And you have to work on the assumption that anything you put there will be in public, and so a potential employer might be able to see it and it might come back on you. So, think accordingly before you post things. But I wonder whether generations who have been born after the invention of social media have a different relationship with it maybe, and how almost everything in their whole lives goes on there. I shudder to think how many times I might have been fired if everything I thought or said as a teenager was in the public domain.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And that's one of the things I do think is pretty interesting because Facebook privacy settings, which I will say that there's been a number of times that someone had privacy settings set, but one of their connections wasn't quite as good a friend as they thought. And so they screenshotted it.
Yeah, exactly.
You just need one person who's not really your friend to run into issues there. But things like privacy settings. Well, the research suggested most people didn't use privacy settings on Facebook. They don't use a lot of those tools that protect them through sites. And so, a lot of content is public. And Facebook would do stuff like change the settings on you where suddenly your posts are public or that type of thing too, where it's not, as easy. So I used to do quite a bit more of there's professional accounts and there's personal accounts, and they don't overlap. And I think that seemed like a good idea, and I think conceptually it can be okay. The issue then becomes, what do your contacts actually do? So one of the things that happened for me is becoming part of the Management and Organizational Behavior Teaching Society. A lot of those people were on Facebook, and they want to be friends with you on Facebook, but they're professional contacts as well. Some are your friends and some are your, acquaintances. And things like they have a Facebook group that people post on. And so suddenly you have all these professional contacts on your Facebook that used to be personal, because some of them are your friends, but even your friends are still professional friends. And so I think that's where it can get blurry as well, is that unless you keep a very hard line on that, like if you have any, and that's what I would actually do on Facebook, is I'd have a filter for minus professional. So posts that seem personal were that. But over time that blurs even more. And my professional friends also like Marvel movies and Star Wars and stuff like that. And so those things that I would keep for that audience, away from that audience, they would still like that stuff. And now stuff like posting about my kid, like the professional people I have on there, a lot of them love seeing pictures of that type of stuff. And so it's definitely a weird balance, I think, to try to keep, okay, what's your personal, what's your professional, because they may blur themselves. I do like that about LinkedIn. LinkedIn can be kind of a straight professional one. Although we've also seen people post a lot of personal life things on that too. Was it LinkedIn appropriate hashtag of like what really is appropriate or not for LinkedIn? How personal is it? And as people have gotten disgruntled with Facebook and Twitter, X, and all that stuff, some people have kind of moved their game on to LinkedIn to some degree. That used to be their stuff that used to be only for that personal site is now on LinkedIn. So it's interesting because, the boundaries that we might set, it's harder to get those boundaries with others. Even stuff like, do you show your kid on social media? Well, does your mother-in-law show your kid on social media? Does your kid's friends show them on social media? It's not nearly as clear cut as you would like, because the content can get out there.
Absolutely. And social media itself has become so pervasive, like you almost can't have a social life without it now. So if you're not putting stuff on there, then you're almost like a pariah, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, that's, with some people, they use like chat related apps, so WhatsApp and stuff, as opposed to the social media profile. But, that type of thing, again, that can be shared. Those things, can be hacked. And so it's not that if we're only chatting through WhatsApp, that doesn't mean that it is really private. That's what we've seen across a lot of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, at least with WhatsApp, it's end-to-end encrypted, and the only people seeing it are the people you've chosen to send it to. But again, you're back to that same problem of, what if one of your friends isn't as good a friend as you think?
Yeah, screenshot it.
Whatever. Yeah, and they could do that with a text message even. So you're not even using a social app at that point. Maybe we should just go back to phone calls. Yeah.
Well, you can record phone calls, and in the U.S., at least in some states, only one side has to consent to the recording.
Yeah, I don't even know what the law is.
I don't know the UK rules on that one, but
no, I don't either.
It's pretty easy. Yeah. Half the states in the U.S. you can record without the other person knowing, and it's fine.
Yeah, yeah, it's a worry, isn't it? It is.
Yeah.
So one final thought on the LinkedIn bit. So I think part of that is LinkedIn's own branding, isn't it? Is that they want to be seen as the work network, the workplace alternative to Facebook, which is fine. But then I agree, it is getting a bit more personal. But I do think part of that is because of this whole authenticity movement, and it's a big deal in marketing, isn't it? And I get it. I think it's kind of tipped again beyond the line again, or back the other way again now, because so many people are doing it because they want to be seen as authentic, and so to appear authentic, they're being inauthentic and putting whatever it might be. And obviously there's parallels there in leadership as well, because authenticity is quite a powerful approach for building trust and relationships and all sorts of things as a leader. So it is an interesting one. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing if you share more of the personal side, let's call it, on a place like LinkedIn, as long as it's genuine. And I feel like quite a lot of people are missing that last bit.
Yeah, genuine is hard. And, with the sites too, what's their goals? So, like LinkedIn has added games recently. So there's daily games. Yeah.
I noticed that.
Yeah, so check out LinkedIn Games. They just added a new one that I played a couple times now, which is kind of Sudoku-esque. But that's the issue too, is like these sites, how do they monetize? What do they do? And that monetization can, imperil kind of your privacy as well in a lot of ways too. So that's another complication sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, and same is true of Facebook and all the others as well. So, I mean, going back to that, using it for work purposes, like it might be the perfect tool to build a community among your customers, for example. But the problem is, it's how is the platform monetizing it? It's doing it by ads. It's doing it by owning the data. So you may not always have ownership of whatever you've put in there. And like LinkedIn again, like they did one quite recently. I think it happened in the States maybe a month or so ago, where they added to their terms and conditions about using whatever you post for training of AI models.
Oh yeah, I did see.
They have added an opt-out, but it's automatically on unless you go in and check it. And again, that to me feels a bit, naughty.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's appropriate at all. But that's we're seeing a lot of AI stuff right now.
Yeah. I mean, at least Meta, they actually sent emails out when they did that and said, look, if you want to opt out, here's the link, go and do it. Whereas LinkedIn, it was totally under the radar. I only know because someone flagged it in a post.
Yeah, that's nice. Yes, I saw some co-author on LinkedIn mentioned it and how to click it off. So
yeah. So I think there's a question mark there about the ethics of it all, and ethics of AI in general. That could be a whole other episode. In fact, we've done episodes on that in the past. So
yeah, there's lots out there too.
In all of your career so far, what's been your best experience of being led?
So I think, there's been a few that I think were pretty good. One of the experiences I had being on the Management Organizational Labor Teaching Society board, a colleague, a friend, a mentor of mine, Michael Stratton, when he was the leader of it, I think one of the great things with he being on the board is you've got a bunch of academics. Academics have opinions and they also have expertise, and they're not afraid to share that information and their opinions, right? That's true a lot of job types. So academics, I'm not just picking on you. That's the one I know the best. But the idea of being like, okay, we want to make sure people have their chance to speak their piece, that we embrace those different opinions and allow that debate to happen versus, just eye rolling or just trying to cut off people from speaking or just trying to, group think it. And I thought that was a really good leadership situation because it really was, okay, this is what, this is how everyone should have their opinions expressed. And even if we don't all agree on it, that's the best way to do it. And so I think I kind of managing that. And also, but you don't want somebody speaking for an hour and a half at a meeting on a tangent, on an irrelevant tangent, not the useful tangents we have. But being able to manage that, but also have that respect. And I think that's a really key aspect is we don't have to agree on something, but that doesn't mean we should cut off people's ability to express those opinions. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be allowed within whatever the context we have of what's appropriate to be able to do so. So I think that was one of the best leadership experiences I saw, kind of managing these people with very different opinions and different ways of doing stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good lesson for leadership anywhere, isn't it? I feel like academics must be quite good at that sort of healthy debate, though. Is that?
Well, it varies a little bit. In part, the healthy debate can be unhelpful. Well, healthy debate is helpful, but you've got people that have long tenured periods at places. You've got people that have, baggage of this time, or you've got their feuds with each other type stuff. You've got people with different areas of expertise. And so that expertise, you might apply well in some places, you might apply completely inappropriately in other places. And so, I think academic discussion can be great, but sometimes it can be, this thing happened 20 years ago and I'm still angry on it. It can be, I think my field is doing real work, but your field is stupid. That comes up as well. Like you'll see sometimes that fight between the humanities or engineering. Like I've seen posts on Twitter from people in the humanities that will be like, we don't need business schools. We should dissolve all of them because they don't do anything useful, right? That's that. I don't agree with that. I wouldn't agree with the opposite, that humanities should be dissolved. All of this stuff is really important for us. We need people with different perspectives, and we need people to learn a lot of different things. But you can get kind of this, polarization, especially as we have conflict or limited resources. And I think that can be where we get academic issues sometimes, is limited resources or the potential for conflict on, okay, your leadership paradigm, if it's popular, mine can't be popular, so I'm gonna start a fight with you. Yeah, if you taking a look at articles and responses to articles and then responses to responses is a very fun thing to look at, of academics arguing with each other. Sometimes pretty politely, sometimes barely politely enough to be in the journal. So yeah, academics can get in spirited debates in good faith and bad faith, but it's an area where we often have an opportunity to do some of those debates. While in some organizations, you disagree, you get fired.
Well, yeah, that's one way of looking at it, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if that's encouraging or not. Let's say it is. We'll take the optimistic route.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay. So this, I think some people would say this is quite a difficult question. So we'll see how you get on with it.
Okay. Cool.
If you could go back in time, how far back in your life would you go, and what would you say to your younger self?
I think it's really hard because I think there's kind of an assumption that like we could actually convince our younger self of something, but I'm pretty pessimistic, like, right? Because it's like, that's the whole like, oh, old people giving young people advice is like, the old person has this information, you have the wisdom, you're like, I want to give this to you, and the kid's like, nope, I'm on TikTok right now. So I'm a little pessimistic on getting any child to listen, but definitely myself. But when would I go back? I do think maybe going back to high school and just talking to myself related to think about what you want to do and why. Because I do think kind of my own career path, I think it's worked out. But I mostly kind of like, you do good in primary school, and then you go to college and do well, and then you just keep trying to get good grades and keep going. But really, you should be thinking, what's the career you want? What would be valuable to you? And so to me, things like career exploration would have been very useful. So something like, I do kind of technology from the management side, but could I have been a computer scientist? Maybe. I think that'd be an interesting area to go into. I might have invented Facebook if I had thought about it. Zuckerberg was in college at the same time as me. He might have been a better programmer, but I didn't try that. I didn't start that up. At a younger age, I didn't really think in that direction. So I think my advice would be related to like really try to figure out what's a job that you think works for you. What do you want to do? I think is helpful. Now, do I think high schooler myself would listen? I don't know. I think it's hard to say, but I do think there's a lot of like not thinking about where you want to go or what you want to do. It's just checking the box, moving forward. And so I think I've ultimately moved forward to somewhere I want to be. But there could have been some other path that would have been as good or even better that I just wasn't thinking about, okay, what's the future I want? I just get good grades and just keep going, I feel like was a little bit too much of my perspective at a younger age. And, we can get into that even now. It's like, oh, just get another publication, get another this. But what really are you trying to accomplish is something I try to think about. Because, yeah, you get buried in the moment to moment. But I think he wouldn't care. Gordon would just keep going, doing what he wants to do. So yeah, it'd be like in the time travel movies where you can't change the past.
Yeah.
But maybe I'd come back to the future and like my life would suck because I made some bad choice based on some stupid exploration, or maybe I'd love being a zookeeper or something. I don't know, but it would have been better to like think it through. Is my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it made me think of the Back to the Future too. The bit with old Biff going back and how hard he had to work to persuade his younger self.
Bet on would be good. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's always the one. Yeah, what to invest in or something.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I mean, even having the literal answers in a book in his hand, he still had to almost beat him up to get him to do it, didn't he? In the end.
Yeah.
So, anyway, yeah, a great example of ruining the future as well, of course.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think that's quite a good answer, though. It's potentially actually quite a different answer to what a lot of people would say to that, because I mean, particularly that sort of the high school kind of age. I mean, certainly my experience of that age was almost like the pressure on us to think about that future career and decide right now what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And then all the qualifications you pursue have to go towards that. I mean, I found that quite stressful at the time. And of course, I didn't end up doing that career anyway. So it was all, I mean, it wasn't wasted. No education is wasted, but it was misdirected maybe.
Well, that's why I think the whole thing might wash out, because it's kind of like, how does your knowledge apply well? It's just, it's like, yeah, as a kid you should figure out better how to do something, but can you? Like, I don't know. You kind of, your path is how you figure out what it is of where you are. It's just, if you could get it done earlier, you could be more successful. You could be winning Nobel Prizes now or whatever, right?
Yeah. Maybe,
but it's
maybe
how?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, theoretically, maybe. But how would you possibly get to that point? Yeah, like you can't there's some comic characters where, like a Starhawk, where if he dies, he gets born a baby but remembers everything of the life he led. And you think, like, in the theoretical sense, that should prepare you for great success potentially, I guess, right? Because you actually would have the lessons in the past of what you learned, sort of your previous lifetime going through that stuff. So he would kind of do it with, like, the Guardians of the Galaxy would get wiped out and he'd die and he'd be like, well, I'll go back in time and make sure the Guardians don't make that same mistake. But, so he had a very clear, like, goal setup. But for us as humans, what it'd be like, oh, I'm going to be a computer scientist next life. But maybe that would be miserable. You'd be like, okay, I'm going to go back and be a zookeeper next time. I don't know. But then what are your goals? You could have a very great career that you feel like you didn't accomplish anything that mattered, but you had a great life. What's the line of what your goals are? I don't know. That's where it gets hard, I feel like.
Depends how many times you're allowed to go back as well, of course, because the priorities might shift.
Oh, I think they would. Yeah, no, they absolutely would shift over time.
Yeah. Well, it's a fun one to think about, though. Anyway, well, on that subject, last question. This one's always my favorite as well. It's called Leadership Heroes.
Leadership Heroes.
So if you had to pick one person, it could be anyone you like, alive or dead, past or present, real or fictitious, but it has to be someone who, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership. So who would that be and why?
So what comes to mind to me, and it just feels like book promo, but Black Panther from the Marvel movies, I think, is a really great example of a good leader, because a lot of his focus is on, building relationships with people, not putting people in boxes as good or bad, but as people that can be worked with. So early in the Black Panther movie, he fights against this guy M'Baku. It's supposed to be a fight to the death. M'Baku's certainly trying to kill him, but he doesn't kill M'Baku. He's like, okay, he spares M'Baku's life, basically. And ultimately in the movie, that has a huge impact on, like, Black Panther would not be able to succeed if he had killed M'Baku there. And even with that, when he finds out through, the Killmonger character that his own dad did things that were wrong, instead of Black Panther getting defensive or trying to deny it, he really does accept this and he's got sort of a scene where he's in whatever the afterlife or whatever, like kind of confronting his dad about those bad things. And that's kind of what we need to do, right? When we get information, we need to be able to change our opinion. We need to be able to do what's right versus what, is comfortable. And I think that's something with a leader that I think is really helpful. And even in the film, too, with Killmonger at the end, he's still willing to give this guy a chance, even though this dude's trying to kill him. Killmonger doesn't take that opportunity, but I do think it's sort of a perspective that is very helpful. How can we still be open to other people? We don't want to be exploited, but also there is good in other people, and most people, their goals are not malevolence. It's there's the potential for them to be productive in society and help us. And so, I do think, to me, Black Panther does embody a lot of those things we want to do as a leader. We want to include people. We want to not just push ahead. We want to be open to the facts and reality, even if they're not what we would prefer. Those things to me are all things as a leader we need to do. I don't think it's easy. I think it's very difficult a lot of times, and we get it wrong sometimes, especially when we get too confident we know everything perfectly, because we don't. And so, yeah, as a leader, you're going to be wrong every day, but you're hoping to improve those things and get better. And you've got to be ready that maybe things have to be corrected or fixed or that. And so to me, that Black Panther does a good job of kind of, showing that important aspect.
So my wife and I, at least once a year, we do a rewatch of the MCU. So we're actually, at the moment, we're partway through Civil War.
Oh,
obviously, that was the first one where Black Panther appears.
Good movie.
And even in that one, I think there's maybe not to the same extent or in the same way, but there is quite a good leadership lesson there in the way he reacts to the Winter Soldier / Bucky. Well, no spoilers, it's been out long enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, because at the start, obviously, he thinks he's just killed his dad, so he's on a dead set revenge. Nothing else enters the headspace. He's being very driven by that emotion. But by the end of it, they're maybe not friends, but he's at least on the path to forgiveness, isn't he?
He's willing to help. He's willing to somebody who needs
help. Exactly. And so even then, he's able in that extreme situation to set aside that kind of the negative emotional, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, imperative maybe, and rise above that and be a little bit more leadery.
Yeah, absolutely. Very true. Very true.
Yeah, that's a good example. Awesome. Well, Gordon, it's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. The last thing I will ask you is if any of the listeners want to know more about you, maybe get hold of one of those books or two, where can they go to learn more?
So certainly LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. If you look up Gordon Schmidt, you'll find me pretty easily there. The books, Leaders Assemble Leadership in the MCU, about Marvel movies and leadership, and then Elements of Leadership. I think Lessons from Avatar: The Last Airbender. It comes out in November of this year. So by the time this episode comes out, it should be out. Both of those are available through Amazon. So if you look up the title or look up Gordon Schmidt there, they should come up pretty easily. I'm still on Twitter /X, although it's mostly to share comic books I bought with comic book people. Although I do still talk academics a little bit. We also do some blogs through talentmetrics.io. So when we see a pop culture thing, we think about a management topic, we tend to write about it. So we've done ones about Barbie. We did ones about the most recent Indiana Jones movie. We got a very cool one about Loki season 2, which explains using some of the creativity blocks that are known, some of the biases of why Loki behaved as he did in season 2. So that ends up pushing us into sort of cultural theory, I guess. But it does show pretty well some interesting management concepts. So those are kind of some of the main places. So I'm around. Feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk to people about the stuff we're doing, whether it's any of my research areas or I don't know. I like to talk about most stuff, honestly, related to management and psychology. So I'm happy to chat with anyone who wants to.
Excellent. Well, I'll put some of those links in the show notes as well so people can find those easily. And yeah, well, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thank you again so much for being with us today. It's been great.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It was a good chat.
Thank you again to Gordon for his time today. Great conversation. Went down a few tangents that I didn't expect as well. So that's always more entertaining and a more enjoyable conversation. Listener, I hope you got loads from that. I'm sure you did. Viewer as well, if you're on YouTube with us today. If you would like to learn more about Gordon and what he does, perhaps get in touch, read his blog, get a copy of one of those books. Do check those links in the episode description. And as always, every week I say this, I do encourage you to click on those links, reach out to him, learn more things. Don't just take our 1 hour conversation. There is much more to be learned. And on that note, if you are a new leader in whatever form that may take, whether it's a first-time supervisor or line manager or a first-time founder, you're starting your own business and you need to hire people or you have hired people in leadership, something you're worried about or something that you're struggling with, then do reach out to me as well. You'll find my LinkedIn link down there too. And of course, there is the Integrity Leaders community too. Head over to the website, www.leadernotaboss.com. Click on that green button, come and join us. And as a podcast listener or viewer, you can use the promo code, which is halfoff24. So that's HALFOFF24. all in caps, and that will give you 50% off, as the code suggests, forever, for as long as you remain a member. So can't say fairer than that. Come along, give it a try. If it's not for you, it's a monthly membership, so you can cancel it any time. No worries there, but do come and join us. Plenty to learn. You'll get early access to the podcast as well. You get it a week before anyone else. And there's regular events, there's leadership content, and other people who are in the same boat as you that you can learn from, network with, and more. So come and give it a try. Hope to welcome you in there very soon. That's almost all I've got time for this week, almost this year, in fact. We're coming up on the Christmas period now. And it's that time of year again for my annual Christmas podcast episode release extravaganza, or some other clever marketing phrase for a Christmas run. Because Christmas falls right in the middle of the week this year, I've gone back and forth quite a few times on the schedule for this. So what I've decided is, starting tomorrow, there will be a run of 3 daily episodes. So we have a 2-parter with the very excellent Rachel and Kieran McKenna of Wood Hazel Consulting. We'll be talking all about sales, marketing, mindset, imposter syndrome, confidence, communication, leadership, of course, and the many crossovers between those various areas of expertise. It's a great conversation. They are a pair of wonderful humans, and I really enjoyed it. I know you will as well. And the reason it's a 2-parter is because I honestly found it really difficult to bring that conversation to a close, because I didn't want to. I wanted to keep talking. So best thing, as ever, with something that's 2 hours long is split it in half. So you get 2 1-hour episodes. You can listen to them back to back if you like. If not, one at a time. Break it up to you. Then on Monday, the 23rd, we'll be releasing the Christmas special. We have a whole host, a gaggle, a pack, not a murder, that's the wrong word for Christmas, but a collection of various guests as ever. It's an ensemble episode. We'll be covering some silly Christmas questions, but there's also a leadership theme behind it all as well. It's a bit of fun. It's something we do every year. And many of the guests really lean into the silliness of the season. And I've absolutely loved recording all of those little segments and revisiting some past favourite guests as well. Hope you'll be there with us for that. I will then, I'm afraid, be taking a couple of days off because it's Christmas. So Christmas Eve, there won't be an episode. Christmas Day on Wednesday, there won't be either. On Boxing Day, I'm trying something new for you this year as well. Boxing Day feels like the day for the clip show, doesn't it? So there'll be a compilation episode of some of my favourite moments from this year on the podcast. So do give that a listen and let me have your feedback on what you think about that as well, whether it's something to keep going or not. Up to you. I'll be swayed by the listeners' and the viewers' opinions on that one. And then for another first, on the 31st of December, we'll be doing a New Year special this year as well. For those of you who aren't that into Christmas for whatever reason, no judgment, that's entirely up to you. And I recognise that it's not everyone's cup of tea, being very British about it when I say that. So I also wanted to do an end of year special for those of you who aren't celebrating Christmas, because it isn't universal, despite what the TV adverts want us to think. So again, it will be another ensemble episode. There'll be a load of guests, some of them from the Christmas special, some of them not. Very much a collection of familiar faces and one or two new ones, I think, as well. We'll be talking about two key themes, really. What's our biggest takeaway from 2024? What are we most proud of in our businesses this year? And what are we going to do differently in the new year? What is our leadership New Year's resolution, if you will? So that should be an interesting one. Hopefully plenty to learn in that episode as well, and slightly less silly than the Christmas one, I'm afraid. Although a lot of them were recorded back to back, so we will still be wearing Christmas jumpers probably, but hopefully you can forgive us for that one for the sake of logistics and efficiency. Anyway, so as I do every year, I've created probably too much work for myself, but it's all good because I love it, and I really do hope that it's helpful to some or all of you in the audience as well. I hope you'll join me again for those. So I'll be back again tomorrow. And until then, thank you as always so much for listening or watching or both, and be a leader, not a boss.